had like a one MC one for my supervisor.
And I saw the data on, and I think that
word
like,
was, but someone was like, we should do that, we should set something
together, but actually,
one word and just symptoms. Other like really smart person comes in and says, oh, we shouldn't say that.
show and stuff.
They don't even know that that was it. I think it's like they just literally changed. Yeah. Somebody, one of the guys,
yeah, we'll have to chat. It's great to meet you. I don't know your name probably on it, yeah.
He's creating the software.
Okay. Hi everyone. Hi. Thank you for coming to our second Data Bytes, which we firstly, my name is Hannah, and I am the Civil Society Data Officer here at City Hall. Essentially, my remit of work, I sit in the community engagement team, and it's thinking about the ways that City Hall can support civil society in using their data better, developing their data maturity, data capacity, with kind of the long-term ambition being that then civil society who work on the ground have all this knowledge, that knowledge can feed up into the work we do here, so we're better informed by what goes on. And we set up sort of this Data Bytes, I don't know what to call it, network, for sort of data for good organisations who kind of work in this field too, and in this space, to kind of be a place to collaborate and share ideas, projects, and talk through sort of challenges and success stories of different projects which go on. So we've got three kind of quite meaty topics to discuss today, and three very apt people presenting on them, but we also want it to be kind of a discussion, so they're going to do a presentation, but open floor to sort of conversation as well. So first we have Giselle from DataKind, who's going to talk to you about data ethics frameworks and their work on that. So yeah, thank you. Enjoy.
Time in the last invite, so if it's okay, I'm going to sit down on the calendar during a Friday, kind of time. So DataKind, does anyone need an introduction to DataKind? Charity that helps other charities to data science, but I think I kind of know everyone. The project I'm going to talk about here is a bit atypical for what we do. So a small portion of our work is effectively like consultancy, where it's strategically helpful for the social sector and for us as an organisation. And this is a project I'm going to talk about that fits into that bucket. So the general topic here is ethics, but very specifically ethics related to the health and medical research charities. So I'm going to talk a bit about the project we did and then broaden that out to kind of some overall top tips or concepts that kind of go over all of this. So to give you a background for this, so there's an organisation called AMRC, the Association for Medical Research Charities. They are an umbrella body for, I think it's about 80 medical research and health charities, so kind of all good names that you'd expect, and some others. They realised that their membership were really nervous about tech partnerships, because of all the reasons you'd expect, like the information asymmetry, using different words for the same thing, and big companies having a lot of clout, etc. But they also, their members were saying that we want to do this. It wasn't a lack of kind of desire, it was just a lack of confidence. So how can we try and bridge that? And one method is creating essentially a framework for which those organisations can then hang their specific context, their specific needs on, but something for which that they at least kind of know the space they're operating in, and what it is they need to kind of understand as they have these partnerships with these big tech firms. So that's what we went about doing. And I know it's like a horrible mouthful, like data ethics framework. Why isn't it just like the principles themselves? So the reason it is a framework rather than a list of principles is because organisations are different and their principles are going to be different. So instead of creating a set that doesn't fit everyone, we created a framework that has 9 kind of high levels within it that we can adapt. So in terms of research methods, we looked at over 60 different ethics principles. I guess a good thing, it's a very good sign that there are absolutely loads proliferating, but at the same time it can be a bit of a bad thing as well, because it just makes intimidating and impossible for small non-profits in particular to navigate them, and also to know which ones to use, etc. We had a look at all of them and stuck them together in something coherent. We also had a bunch of interviews and a workshop with AMRC members. So it got us to, I have, it's got like 40 slides in the slide deck, but don't worry, I will not all of them. But it got us, so it got us to a place where we had 9 principles. Here we go. So 9 principles. So they're down the side on the right. So beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, explicability, sustainability, open research, community-mindedness, and proportionality. So basically like a dyslexic person's nightmare, I would say, from the third person. The idea here is that in all the principles that have popped up for doing digital data tech, particularly in relation to health products, but not only in relation to health products and services, you can group them all under these 9. We know because we basically mapped all of them out. So, like for example here, we've got some that fall under technology and data. We've got these 5, which are literally taken from the AI for people work on this. We said, okay, how do these 5 map to these 5 buckets map to a bunch of other things that came out of that, looking at 60 sets of ethical principles. They like sometimes they do very clearly. Sometimes it's a bit messier. So we said, okay, we're not going to try and create some kind of mapping one-to-one of all these things. Instead, we're going to go for a more kind of literary perspective where we put them in buckets in a more qualitative way, and then test them out with various organisations that are part of AMRC. And so that's exactly what we did. As an example of like perhaps one of these, so I guess here we have a very techy example, so explicability. We found that the one case where medical research was going wrong, and where explicability as an ethical principle would have avoided that, was here where we've got X-rays of lungs in order to detect, it was to detect an element of lung cancer by, well, no, was it? No, it wasn't. It was that thing at the top, and basically the computer was making a bit of a judgment based on the presence of this text. So this basically means whether it was the machine used to do the scan was mobile or whether it was permanent while in hospital. And the AI was drawing a conclusion from that, which could be okay if that leads to useful outcomes. Could also be problematic if it turns out that that's only applicable in one particular health trust and not for the next one, but yet it's still using the same dodgy machine learning. So when you apply explicability on top of that, you can understand what all those inputs mean and what outputs they lead to. So that's a kind of techier example. So for bioethics, there's kind of Georgetown 4, which are more, you kind of see them as more medical, like do no harm and do good as 2 separate things. Serve human agency, be fair. As you get into like one of the 9 is partnering. As you get into that, it's things that are very broad and apply everywhere. As you get into more health ones, you can have things that like preserve human agency, which for some problems might not apply and for others might. So they kind of become potentially more contextual. So going back to our 9. So this is all well and good to have this list of 9, but what do you do with it as a medical health charity? The problem we were finding, we did workshops for example, was that there was a lot of great discussion about these, and it was through workshops that we got to these 9, but there was like big questioning phases when we then talked about like the what ifs and how you'd implement that. So to get around that, we created essentially sort of like a list of questions. So we said for each of these 9 things, here are questions that when you're sitting down with a tech partner or someone who actually knows more about this than you do, in terms of the data or digital, then these are the questions to make sure you're on the same level and you have the same understanding when it comes to these ethical principles. And it's that set of questions which I don't think no, this just tells you how we did those, which was to look at other example sets, for example. But I don't think I have a set here. But they're kind of what you would think. So as like techie or data people. So for proportionality, for example, there'll be questions about like what's the impact on the individual, both positive and negative, what's the impact on society or your wider group, both positive and negative, and how you might weigh those two things up. So this is what we did, and it's, as you can see, it's quite dense, and I have a limited period of time. So I thought now I've given you kind of the overview of what we created and why and how, I'll take you through essentially the summary steps that we think are accessible and applicable to smaller non-profits who, irrespective of whether they're in the health space or medical research space or not, who might want to be thinking about these things. And I'd love your thoughts on them, and also whether you, like your direct thoughts on them, but also how you think that they might apply or be digested by the organisations you come across. So there are 5. Number 1.
Are you going to share these slides?
Yeah, okay,
these,
yep.
At least these, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So number 1 is understanding your environment. So the key question here, like, what's the context you're working in? So here we go. So for us, that blue bubble bit is the context we're working in. So you possibly can't see it very well at the back. A little bit data and digital health research by charities in the case of the NMRC project, and then around kind of the outside is the other aspect. So on the right, it's about technology partnerships. At the bottom, it's the fact you're a charity or a non-profit rather than a for-profit. And then on the left, public health, and at the top, I think, biomedical research. So we identified them as the different existing contexts that you would want to wrap in. So that gives you kind of an idea of the non-linearity of this, and the fact that you have, in particular because ethics are so contextualised, you kind of have to pull things in from different contexts, wrap them up, and say this is our particularly unique context and how things apply to us. So I'd say that a good first step in building kind of ethical digital data tech products or services is understanding what this is for the particular organisation you're working with. And it's obviously less catchy than just saying like digital health, but it's also hopefully useful. Number 2 is don't reinvent the wheel. So can you use an existing framework? Like one of the reasons we didn't create a new set was that we wanted to be a bit more agile, a bit more adaptable to different organisations. But another reason is just that we don't need any new sets. So there are, I think I've pasted in the top of our table that we used. There you go. So this is just some of the ones we looked at. This looks like about 20 of them, so about a third. And they're really good, like loads of them are really good. I would say often you feel they're a bit perhaps incomplete because your context is different from their context. But there's loads of good stuff out there. So don't worry about starting from scratch. Like, do have a look after you've assessed your context, see if it's similar to someone else's and if they've already done this, and perhaps either use theirs or adapt theirs. Number 3, plan your route. So this is about the fact that we want to know how this stuff, where this stuff's going to go. So like putting this all on like some slides and presenting it to the world on a website is all well and good, but actually who's going to use it? Who's going to perhaps butt heads with it in it? Like who's going to not like it? Who's going to want to use it but have a problem with it? Who's going to not want to use it but is the person you've designed it for, and so therefore it's kind of totally redundant. Who are, just the kind of the standard thing about who are all your stakeholders, what do they want, where are they coming from. In particular, I think there's something very interesting here about putting together people who do have very different expertise, because in terms of like service design, we'll often want to go to the service users, and they're obviously a key stakeholder group here, but in terms of developing ethical principles and doing it in a tech, data, digital context, wrap in those people as well, like get an ethicist involved, have a chat with them, talk to some people who have done specialist AI in the area. So I think it is very much more broad kind of crowdsourcing than you might be used to doing when we're thinking about service design from a less kind of tech perspective. And we found, so this is the start for us, was the start of a conversation rather than an exercise in itself. So one thing we found when we had these conversations was that everyone we were speaking to needed more, was hungry for more guidance on how to implement this stuff and how to do ethics in whatever context they were in. And so if we hadn't have been having all those conversations, we might not have known there was those needs and those skills gaps in those areas. Number 4, check heading in the right direction. So do principles express your values? Do they resonate with your service users? Sorry, that's been cut off. So as I've kind of been saying before, this is after you're kind of doing that stakeholder exercise, like actually understanding ideally in quite a, I would say, it's probably a bit controversial, but I'd say in quite much a confrontational way, trying to find out if these things are actually going to stick. Because the thing with ethics is that you start talking about it, and everyone wants to be ethical, and everyone says they're ethical, and it's all good. But actually, if it comes down to the nitty-gritty, there are particular ways of doing your project that people might not actually agree with. So kind of getting down to that stuff and seeing if people are actually going to go with it or not is kind of the key bit here. And that's the bit that is cut off is, we said, service users, staff, partners, etc. And then number 5, the last one, so press start on your ethical principles. There's been a bit of like a car metaphor going here, and this is like a really modern car where you don't even need a key, just the press start. So this is about implementing, so sorry again being cut off, but how do you implement your principles and monitor the consequences of your products and services. So the thing we find here is that, like, with a lot of the ethical guidelines that already exist, they kind of exist for them in themselves, but obviously it's not handy for them to exist in themselves. So that's why we created a set of questions that was the immediate what ifs that came out of that. Also, what's probably more accurate, that came out of that set of principles. But similarly, it doesn't. That's a journey. It doesn't stop there. So I would recommend that these are always living documents, and you don't see them as signed and sealed at any point. I would also say that you kind of work out what happens when you implement according to those principles, and also what happens when you don't. So I think we see failure of being ethical as highly visible. But what about the success of being ethical? What does your machine learning model actually do to change the outcomes of the people who interact with it, even though you did everything right? You think you did everything right along the way. So it's that kind of evaluation of how the tech's working, but also how it's affecting decision making, and how individuals might be over reliant on it or come to kind of use it in a different way you intended. So it's seeing all these things we thought about as applicable at every stage of the journey rather than just in the building phase. That's the 5. I'd love, this is our kind of work in progress, because as you saw from the first half of the presentation, there's a lot there. So this is the way we tried to distill it. I would love kind of thoughts on that, either now or just, you know where I am, in the kind of immediate future. On that. Is there any thoughts or perhaps questions? Fine.
Hi. So I was involved in a little bit of work that Nesta was doing at one point. very similarly trying to compare some of these ethical frameworks. And one of the sort of other considerations that seemed to crop up was about the impact of decisions that you make have it in the future as technology changes. And when and sort of I think it fits into your sort of what's the process, because something that you could make a decision about in terms of the use of data at the moment might mean in the future, because the world changes, other data sets are released, etc., you would then not make the same decision. Did you find that in any of the frameworks, or how would you sort of approach that type of problem?
I feel like it's a hard one because it's just inherently unpredictable, or at least I've never found a good prediction of whether the future's going to go in terms of tech. So I feel like it comes back to that being a working document, and maybe it's about putting in a structure where you hold yourself accountable to that, and like going kind of not just saying it's iterative but actually meaning it and going back to it. I think it was interesting that in some of the cases that we used, both as hypothetical examples but also that the charity brought to the workshop where we were talking about how we person this, it was interesting how like socially the social context had an impact as well as the technical one. So I think like you could even reframe that question, even if the text stays the same, things are going to change because we're going to have different opinions on all of it. So it feels, I think it's a bit of a monster, to be honest, because it's hard to do this full stop, but then to keep going back to it is a lot of like mental energy, but I think it's necessary.
How do you see data ethics and frameworks affecting procurement, particularly, well, both at a central and a local government level? Because so I represent a GovTech startup, so the challenge is if 150 councils took on a different take on a framework, then as a startup looking with national scope, it's a nightmare upon a nightmare, right, with procurement. So how do you see this kind of work, and other stuff going on around data ethics actually feeding into procurement?
I feel as if working with local government, probably others in their room can kind of give more socialised views than I can, having more experience with them. What I would say is that a lot of this stuff goes above and beyond like legal requirements, and from what I've seen of guidelines around procurement, it kind of hovers at or above the legal requirement and doesn't kind of hop up the next level. Whereas this stuff does. So on the one hand, if that remains the case, then I feel like it's those who are providing those goods and services, it's on them to actually say we're not going to try and like stay at this minimum level, we're going to be better, which I think is like something around GDP more broadly, like that should be seen as baseline. But if local authorities all do go above, then I think that will be a minefield, but I think it's a good one.
So I think as a startup taking that step above, any startup in that space would want to be for that to have some weight in terms of giving them some credibility, some points on the procurement process, whatever that is, to actually say, oh right, okay, government is purchasing products and services from the private sector, which are going to provide above and beyond, and actually, potentially take the UK as a whole into a leading position globally in terms of data ethics.
Very optimistic.
I know. Someone
I like it.
Any more questions? Thoughts? No. Thank you, Giselle. Thank you. We now have Ed to talk about data trusts.
And Vicky, very briefly.
And Vicky, briefly.
Yeah.
From ODI. Great, cool. Help yourself to tea, coffee, more sandwiches. While Ed.
Yeah, I'm gonna
replugs the
try
results.
Vicky, did you want to say a bit about the ODI beforehand?
Hi, I'm Vicky, I'm a delivery manager at the Open Data Institute. So we're an independent not-for-profit based in London, but we work internationally. And we work with companies and to build an open, trustworthy data ecosystem. So one of the big programs we have is an R&D program funded by Innovate UK. One of the projects from last year in that was around increasing access to data while retaining trust. So we looked at a range of different data access models. We made this map that you might have seen on our website. And one of the models that kind of came up in that was data trusts. That will also be mentioned in the independent review of AI in 2017. So we kind of did a little bit more research into that and decided we wanted to pilot at least one data trust. So we did that through that programme, and then we got additional funding from Office for AI, which is a kind of joint department between DCMS and Bayes, which is where this kind of wider work came from. So yeah, one of the pilots was GLA in Greenwich, another one was around food waste, and then another one was around the wildlife trade. We did some kind of wider synthesis work. Whilst Ed's talking, I might just pass around these kind of, we produced like a summary report and a leaflet. There's loads of reports on our website. These are kind of summarised versions, which are a bit more easily digestible than the many, many pages of reports that we publish.
Perfectly timed, just about. I know, I thought I was being clever now, I wasn't being, Hi, my name's Ed. I was the lead consultant on one of the data trust pilots that Vicky just talked through. And I'm going to talk through one which I think is more relevant to the London context, which was the piece of work that we did to think about a data trust in the context of GLA and Greenwich programme called Sharing Cities, which you may or may not be aware of. And also we had this launch last week, and I've been away since then. I have now become a little bit rusty on some of the content of that, so I apologise in advance if I'm not complete, if the slides come as a massive surprise. And I think also it'd be useful to get your sort of thoughts and feedback on that. So data trusts, that's an interesting thing. That's what's that? Yeah. So the ODI initially started this piece of work, as Vicky said, in relation to their research programme, thinking about broader issues around trust, around the use of data. And there are two uses of the word trust. So there's me trusting you to do something, and then there's an organisational form, financial trust or whatever, which connotes a whole load of other stuff and has a whole legal structure around it. So first of all, there is a little bit of issue around some of the sort of linguistic aspects of this. When you see data trust in this context, what we're talking about is more of the governance and legal form here. So in the first instance, the ODI did a piece of work to look at the existing literature on data trusts, governance structures more broadly, and there's a lot of different ways in which people are thinking about a specific idea of a data trust. And there's a very good blog, indeed, on the ODI website where Jack Hardy goes through all of the different models that are out there in the literature. The ODI at that point put forward this idea of a data trust being a legal structure that provides independent third-party stewardship of data. So there's a little bit of redundance, I should say, in the idea of independent and third party there. So I think since this was put out there, they've pulled this definition a bit more tightly. But stewardship, I think, is worth us talking about. So that's looking after, as it were, the use of data and having processes and organisational design to oversee that. So it has, I think, some interesting similarities with some of the issues around the ethical considerations that we heard about just now. So what we've ended up with, or rather what the ODI has come to after what was actually a really intense but quick piece of work. So there were these 3 projects going on at the same time. I was the lead consultant on one, and there were equally others who were leading their pilots. And then we each had legal advice We had an organisation looking at the decision making that a potential trust in that particular sector could make. And then there was also some synthesis of learning across all of that. So when you go on the ODI website, there are lots of reports, if you like reports, but there are also lots of pictures, and this is a particularly nice picture that's been developed of the sort of high-level way in which a data trust could be used. So the data trust is the orange beaked thing at the top, with the world and the context in which data is collected, and the data providers being the sort of pyramid there, and data users getting access to the data via decisions that are made by the trusts. And I can talk about some of those other relationships as we go, and it'll become a bit more obvious as we talk about the GLA approach. So the ODI is putting out there this sort of high-level understanding of what a data trust could be, with an elaboration of the data, of the life cycle that you might want to take in terms of setting one up. And if you are particularly interested in all that, but in the specific GLA project, what we were interested in was to understand the feasibility of creating a data trust in relation to one or more of the Royal Borough of Greenwich Sharing Cities use cases. So Sharing Cities is an EU-funded programme, which is led in totality actually by a team in the GLA. And there are various measures which are being implemented in cities around Europe, and within London, where those are being implemented are in the Royal Borough of Greenwich. They're focusing on building retrofit, car clubs. There is also, the aim is to use Internet of Things technology to support the reduction in carbon more broadly, and they're using that, they're doing that through identifying particular use cases. So we looked at electric parking for electric car club vehicles within the Borough of Greenwich, and within retrofit, within social housing, around putting sensors on the boilers and within residents' homes to better manage the energy use within those. I should say in the first instance, this is an experimental programme, so none of this is being rolled out. Greenwich is currently testing how the data sharing relationships work, also how the technology actually works as well. So our approach to thinking about data trust in this context was, in the first instance, starting at the top, we worked with the teams to do a whole load of service mapping to actually identify these two use cases. So how are the measures installed, how are the decisions made about where they're installed, who's involved in installing all of them, what data and systems is being collected, and what are the long-term uses with it. And that, what became obvious is that in the longer run, because it was a developing program, some of those were not quite yet up and running, but gave us the general idea of the various data sharing arrangements. We then did specific user research with individuals within the system. We had our legal team thinking about some of the legal issues around sharing of data, some of the competitive issues as well. In the system as designed by Greenwich at the moment, most of the measures, and when I mean measures, I mean like sensors in the ground or in people's homes, are being put in by outside suppliers. And so there are legal considerations around data sharing agreements about getting that data back, as it were. Then we had a technical assessment undertaken by Rachel Wilson at the ODI, looking at what the current systems were that were being used, and thinking a bit more in detail from a GLA perspective about the further development of the London data store, so that it has some city data sharing functionality in addition to that. Involve looked at what decisions a trust might make. So sort of related to the question I asked earlier about ethics, how frequently decisions would be made, who are the right type of people, who are the types of people that should be considered as trustees in this idea, in this trust. And then we ran a workshop with a selection of people in organisations who might reuse some of that data if it was made more broadly available. And then we did some really great, although very quick, citizen engagement, you'll be glad to know, with Involve on a Friday afternoon, about a month ago, probably, to talk about the idea of a data trust and what people's expectations are of this sort of organisation. That's a completely illegible picture of the service mapping that we went through, if that makes sense. So thinking about this is the energy use case. So this is the boilers in the sort of district heating systems within social housing. Thinking about the stage, the actors involved, the data that's collected, the touch points. It's a sort of service design approach to it. It's actually really useful in sort of mapping out the data that's being used across the system. This is the high-level, non-technical diagram that we developed in relation to the mobility use case to give a sense of what the data sharing arrangements actually were. So here you have your electric car club, and there is a sensor which communicates with a lamppost, which has been installed, or rather the sensor has been installed, and the data is transferred to an organisation called Smart Parking. They then share data into the London City data store, which is then used by a team, the data science team within what is now the Connected Places catalogue, which used to be the Future Cityscapes catalogue, who then make the data and rather a service layer, sort of visualisation of that data, available to the parking team within the Royal Borough of Greenwich, who are at the moment thinking about how they would use that to make more strategic decisions about it, but potentially could also be used to make real-time decisions about enforcement actions about people parked at the wrong spot. But I think that's some way down the line. As you can see, it's a relatively complicated data sharing arrangement, which is, I think, more something that comes from the particular design of the Sharing Cities programme, which has this idea of they're testing this idea of an urban sharing platform as whether this is a useful approach to it. This was the picture of a data trust that we gave to in our citizens group, which was a little bit more amenable. So you have data collected about you in the real world as you go about doing whatever it is by data providers, who then make that available to a data trust where trustees think about the beneficiaries that they've been asked to think about, to make decisions about, I'm going to cough. Pardon me. Just take this in whilst I... who then make decisions about who gets access to this data. Some of that data is around helping you with those services. Actually, can you pass me that glass of water? Are in relation to the service that you, in which the data is collected, and some are other uses, as it were, and they make decisions about what those other uses are. So I think a big finding for us was how important this aspect was, talking to people about this, and Involve, if you're interested in this in particular, Involve go into more detail about the findings from this research in their report. We also, having engaged with everyone, and this is as far as we were able to get with the work, was to start to think about what different types of trusts could exist. So we developed a data trust canvas, which was very closely based on the business model canvas, and if any of you are familiar with that, which is a useful way of thinking about your business. So we got people to think about what purpose a data trust could take, what the data access technology and processes are, who the data users are, but also then think about the trustees, the decisions those trustees are making on behalf of which beneficiaries. So it's a nice way to sort of summarise very quickly an idea of data trust. I'll go, this is our last slide, with a lot of words on it. At the end of this, I think where we got to was in relation to the specific Sharing Cities programme, our view was that probably works fine as it is without the need of a data trust, and that there are appropriate ways in which that data is being shared. But that there are likely areas where GLA and others might want to do some further thinking about a data trust, that being around health and social care, smart cities data collected more broadly within London by the private sector, and autonomous vehicles was the other one. And I think in terms of going forward in that further development of a data trust, we were suggesting that in many ways, it sounds familiar, I think maybe from the earlier presentation, think about, make sure you've exhausted all of the other options for data sharing arrangements. A data trust can be quite a complicated undertaking, and you need to make sure that it's absolutely necessary for your particular situation. Be clear that all stakeholders have a clear purpose. Why is it that you're doing this? What about the nature of the ecosystem means that the independent third-party organisation is needed? Once you've understood that, make sure that you understand what everyone's incentives are. If there is some data share between data collecting organisations and a data trust, make sure you understand why those data collecting organisations might want to share that data. What's their incentive? Is there a quid pro quo with that sharing of that data? Probably goes without saying, but again, don't try and sort of boil the ocean with this sort of thing. Start small and prove the need. And especially where there is personal data, citizens will need to be involved from the very beginning to make sure that they're happy with the particular approach that you're putting forward. And the involved report again goes through some of the deliberative techniques that you might want to undertake to do that. And these last three are really just about the being clear that you understand what the resource requirements are for the creation of a new organisation. Setting up something like that is not an insignificant undertaking, and it's not just the technical one. And a technical solution would have to be accompanied by organisational capacity. You can't just have a particular data sharing platform. You also need to make sure that the data users have capacity, ability, incentive to be able to use that. You might want to think about how you go around making sure that they have that capacity. Recognise that resources and effort will be needed, goes without saying. And that at any organisation, this is probably something that you feel as sort of third sector organisations, impose a burden on others to be able to use them. There's a sort of knowledge that will need to be imparted to reusers or potential providers of data in order to be able to use any new organisation to make the best out of it. So these were our recommendations to, and I think it's the London Office of Technology Innovation, which is the organisation that's thinking about taking this forward. So these are our recommendations for further thinking about a data trust in the London context. But I run out of time. How am I doing?
That's okay.
Okay. So happy to talk about this, answer any questions, thoughts, reactions.
When do you think a data trust would be appropriate? Like what kind of, I know that's quite a broad question because it's obviously very specific on the context.
Yeah.
But
I should be careful here because I think there's a received ODI position on this, which is, I think, that the jury is out.
okay.
I have a personal view, and so I'll be clear, this is my personal view. I think there are some I'm more convinced that third-party organisations are needed where, for instance, there's a recognition that there's an important data set that could be pulled together that individual organisations have parts of, but none of themselves incentivised to actually bring together, if that makes sense. And, or where they don't trust each other to bring that together. So they would want to have some outside organisation to support. I think there's also again, a personal view. there is an argument around having a data trust to where personal data is involved to demonstrate that the highest possible ethical and sort of security standards are being adhered to. But I think that having that outside of an organisation, in a way, is a recognition that you can't do that internally in your organisation, which for me would be a cause for worry. Like, why can't you internally do it yourselves? So there may well be instances where that's still necessary, but like organisations are enabling and disabling this again. So if you take that capacity out of organisations that collect the data, especially where there are constrained resources within the broader ecosystem, I would worry that people would say, well, they're thinking about that now. I just, we'll just do the technical bit, and then we have someone else that looks after it. Others may have different views.
That was really interesting. Thank you. I'm very excited about Project Slido. And we're really interested in the data trust and kind of watching where they're going. So this is like potentially how I think about them, but it's almost like the data trust can act as some kind of like gateway or almost like a protective layer between like individuals and like private sector companies that are like harvesting and like exploiting data. And it sounds like that's maybe slightly different to the definition that you've landed at. But like I guess my question is like, did you get into conversations about how you get those organisations to agree to something like this if it potentially doesn't work in what they perceive as their best interest? Like, does that then need to be like a legally mandated thing, or like, is there? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you incentivise organisations to agree to like kind of, I guess, having a data trust
imposed?
Yeah.
Now, there were, I would say, hundreds of pages of legal opinion, which I can't remember about this, which I can't remember, / perhaps didn't fully synthesise into my brain, where issues precisely like this were considered. And there is a standing call about whether, in fact, so the situation at the moment is trust law, because data is not property, does not apply. So lawyers are uncomfortable with the discussion of an organisation like we're talking about being called a data trust, because it confuses things and suggests that the law can do things which it currently is not able to. However, their legal position that the two law firms got to, believe, was that there are ways in which things can be incorporated into memorandums and processes within those organisations. They're subject to change, however. So there is an open discussion about whether new law is needed to enable this, and that would require appetite, I think, from central government and for a proven need about it. Those are questions which are sort of outside of my remit, and I wouldn't want to talk on behalf of the ODI about that. Personally, in a situation like that, I think because those commercial organisations, I assume is the types of organisations we're talking about, they would say that they are legally bound to deliver shareholder value, that by deliberately sort of closing down the options in which they could use data would mean that they potentially open themselves up to legal issues, you know, in terms of not delivering shareholder value. I don't think there are any incentives. Well, there might well be broader incentives in terms of brand positioning and all of that to do it, but it wouldn't be across the board, as it were. And would require some capacity of individuals to choose between organisations, which may not always be.
Yeah, And it feels like that's like a really important question in terms of, yeah, like how to kind of position this as an advantage to like kind of big private sector corporations, because I guess we at IF believe that like as you know, like as things as kind of technology and the amount of data that's being collected develops, like companies that can prove they can be trustworthy with things like, will be the ones that like kind of survive, I guess, in this like digital economy and do better, particularly with like new generations of customers that are younger and care more about privacy and kind of data and things like that. So I think that's really interesting, like how do you create this structure in a way that also like incentivizes companies to like want to kind of take part. I think that we could have a really, I think it's a really interesting question. My other question was, sorry, I'm like taking it. It's what, and again, this is probably like how I imagined it in my head versus like the practicalities of things. But it obviously the way that you kind of run the pilots, they were like a few small trusts looking at very specific cases. I imagined that further down the line, like you know, what if these were to become an established structure, that they would have to be like big, not big as in like loads of people and sort of unwieldy, but like sort of have a big remit. And so, for example, there might be one that deals with health data for the whole of the UK, and that almost then by having it, and that as an individual also helps you. If there's less things and there's a few and they're like authorities in it, it's much easier to trust them than there being like loads going on in the background that you maybe don't engage with or do or don't really understand what they do. So like, you know, would you have one for health, one for smart city data, like one for like social media data? I mean, again, that's like whatever, I don't know. But what do you think about that in terms of the scale?
Well, so I talked about this, and we did a workshop prototyping some of these, and it was interesting. In the report, we go through what people thought about so data providing organisations and owners of a data trust, whether this is one organisation or whether it's a number of organisations. And I think, especially within the public sector realm, which I think is quite interesting, and coming from those who work in the public sector, there's a concern that the more people that you have involved in an organisation, the less efficient it might be, and the less likely it might make decisions, or it could be derailed. Like, does one organisation have veto, in which case it becomes like unviable as an organisation. So size, I think, is like, in terms of sustainability of the organisation, is also something to think about, whether the incentives are for the citizens for there to be a public face on health data. But behind the scenes, it's actually completely unfeasible because you're never going to get the reality of all of these organisations to sort themselves out. But there's also a view that you could also have like hugely federated data trusts. Like an individual could have their own data trust, etc. It gets down to the idea of quite technical sort of like, what's it called? Decentralized approaches. And I think also the thing about thinking about it is around, for me, the biggest takeaway that I got was in relation to people's sort of lived experience and understanding of these organisations. I think there's definitely a group of people, and I would count myself as one of them, who really like I'd be all over this, turning off all of the options like you do on the YouTube, so that people wouldn't get access to that. But most people are not like that. And so the nature of the design of data trust as well is that you have trustees that make decisions on behalf of people. So I think there's still this issue to be elaborated around how can organisations be designed so that individuals don't have to make those decisions, yet they have trust in the workings of those organisations. For the GLA one I think that we haven't got to, is the extent to which some of the decisions that trustees might make in a hypothetical data trust that are actually democratic decisions and might come actually under the expanded remit of councillors or London, what are they, representatives?
Assembly members.
Assembly members. And then there's a whole data literacy issue there. You know, are those, you know, even that's the design of the organisation we want. Are those the people we want to be making decisions about? So I think it's a really interesting discussion to keep going on with, and I know that ODI is taking the further work on this forward and thinking about how they support lots of it. So they've been more than welcome to, I'm more than happy as it were to talk in more detail about this.
Yeah, I wanted to also relate to the legal point, which is for the purposes of like a public sector organisation, and if I'm a borough and I'm buying some infrastructure that will produce data, is it not the case that I can sort of just, in procuring that, kind of claim ownership of the data in some way for a data trust? But I don't understand kind of why that would necessarily be an issue in that case. It may be because of the market and because those organisations delivering it, kind of, they see that as the value and they won't want to do it if they don't own it. But I just wondered kind of whether that is an option for the public.
I think it depends how you design your procurement, design that service, and then in the long run how the contract actually is developed. And I think what we'd have to constrain is the use of that data rather than the ownership of it, because again, data can't be owned. And so it's more about the use of that data, that suppliers or subcontractors are not able to, on the basis of the contract you've developed, use it for other purposes other than those which are overseen by a data trust, etc., if you want to develop it like that. I think there's an interesting issue then around whether suppliers then are as eager to undertake those pieces of work on the basis that they know that they're not then subsidising their delivery of their service to you through the reuse of that data.
Yeah, because the way I come at it is because I'm the more traditional social researcher. If I contract a supplier to collect some data from me, I can have complete control over what they can do with it and how long they can hold on to it and all that sort of thing. I appreciate this is kind of quite different and it's different sort of market. But I just wonder whether your understanding of the market is kind of that it could potentially do that over time, kind of give more control to the procurement.
I think it depends on the capacity of the organisation doing the procurement to think about these things, and I think that's definitely something that Greenwich is thinking about, and the GLA, about where do you draw that line? Are you contracting just to deliver services and the data is always under the control of the organisations, or are you doing or is part of the incentive the delivery of those services, further reuse of that data by that outside organisation? Sorry, there's another thing I was thinking about in relation to that. I also think that it's the same with GDPR and with so it's around personal data ethics. It's a risk-based thing. Like, you can't have control necessarily completely over what someone's going to do with the data because there are bad actors. And as we know with sort of Cambridge Analytica and all of that, you can have your T's and C's, but people will still reuse your data in an academic context, in fact. In an inappropriate way. So it's about even when, is it actually in some instances too much of a risk to have outside suppliers for particular data sets, I guess, is the other question.
You have one more question, Ed, and then we'll go on.
I was just wondering, because you've been talking about data trusts making decisions about uses of data, if that includes personal private data, what that means in terms of consent for the initial collection? Because if you've got a certain remit under GDPR that you're giving data to somebody and then sometime in the future that body makes a decision about doing other things with it, does that mean you have to have a really broad thing that someone signs up for, because there could be lots of different uses down the line?
So I'm not a GDPR lawyer. So my understanding, and in GDPR I get this wrong in my head quite a lot as well. I believe, because particularly, let's say, a public sector instance where you're collecting data, in many instances, because it's the delivery of a public service, you don't need consent. Again, that's a broad claim. But I think, therefore, you can individually, as an organisation, make decisions about what uses data is useful on the basis of whether it will deliver a broader public service. So I think that already exists, and I think definitely that already happens. And there are information sharing protocols that exist already. There's also legal data sharing, like you have to share data in some instances between public sector organisations. So the whole consent loop in relation to public sector collection of data is complicated.
I'm sure that's true.
And the question is, for me, is like, if you are a public sector organisation and you're seeking consent to collect data, then that would sort of imply that it's not data that's needed for the delivery of the public service or what you're doing. Yeah, so I think you need to work all of those issues through with a GDPR lawyer and with your data guardian if you have one, or with your broader sort of committee internally.
And I guess I think GDPR is probably enough. There'd be some way that you could argue that, do you know what I mean? That like you could set a data trust up in a way that complies with GDPR. Like,
Yeah, you would have to. But yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think it would be that hard.
So digital catapult did some work around personal data receipts, and my personal view is that moving to a situation where you actually have a receipt that connects you to the data to who you gave it to, which can not only be used for the right to be forgotten, but also to update any new consent that might be needed, might be a way to look at that. So you have some sort of persistent link that over time can be recapitalised or looked at.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. I'm going to bump myself off the agenda, so if you have more questions for Ed, we'll have some time at the end where you can chat to him. Right, now, Natasha from London Plus, isn't it? I'm just going to try and get her presentation. I think the other one was just with the arrow. You can bring it closer to you actually. Yeah. I don't know why I've left it there.
I'm Natasha from London Plus. London Plus is a new organisation, if you don't know us already, aiming to support civil society in London. And one of the areas we want to support civil society in is in data and intelligence, which is my role. Part of my role is trying to upskill civil society in London, and another part is doing some research into the state of the sector. I'm going to talk a bit about some research I'm doing into volunteering in London, and I'll probably go through it quite quickly, and I wanted to use this as a sounding board to get some opinions, both on the analysis I've done, but also how to disseminate this more widely to civil society organisations around London. So we got some funding from the GLA to do research into volunteering specifically in London. There's quite a lot nationally looking at who volunteers, but not too much focusing in on London. So our main questions are, do volunteers in London reflect the diversity of the city? What is the relationship between well-being in volunteers and volunteering? And does volunteering lead to more integration in London? So I'm using understanding society data. So this is a longitudinal household panel study. They followed around 40,000 households from 2009, and it's ongoing. So it's a hugely rich source of data. The same people are interviewed every year, so you can see how changes in situation impact things like changes in volunteering, which I think is very interesting. The samples around about 8,000 to 5,000 people for each wave of interview in London, so it's quite a big sample. It's supposed to be representative of the population, and they've done a lot of work with recruiting people from ethnic minority backgrounds and people who are normally less represented in survey data. So again, a very good sample for the London context. The interviews is not focused on volunteering or civil society. They have a huge range of interviews, I think in around 2 hours. So a lot will be around their work, because it's partly funded by Department for Work and Pensions. But they do ask some questions about volunteering. So this is quite limited. So on the one hand, you have this really rich source of data with loads of different questions. On the other hand, not so much specifically about volunteering. But they do ask every other wave whether the individual has volunteered in the last 12 months and how many hours they spend volunteering. So this is a question I have generally about the surveys. They're only asked every other year, and there's this gap each year. And then they're not asked, have you volunteered since the last survey? It's in the last 12 months. So we've got this big question mark for 12 months beforehand. And I keep going back and forth as to how much of a problem that is. So we've done some descriptive research with this. So we've found quite low numbers of people volunteering. The question's quite broad, do you volunteer? So it's not, do you volunteer formally? But there's also, they don't really prompt you, like this is what volunteering is, they just ask. So we've got around 20 to 25% of people in London who said they've volunteered in the last 12 months. If anything, volunteering is going up, but really there's not much substantial change. And a lot of the findings are quite similar to findings from other surveys. So you've got more volunteers from white British people, women, people who are 16 to 24 years old, so a lot of students volunteering. And also some relationships with social class, so people who have a degree are more likely to say they've volunteered. People from professional occupations or from higher income households. So alongside this, I wanted to do some regression analysis, partly because many of these characteristics overlap. So like I said, we've got more people who are young volunteering, but we know that students are more likely to volunteer, so this could explain why young people are volunteering or not. But I also wanted to predict someone's probability of volunteering, and of course you need to take account of all someone's characteristics when you're predicting their probability, not just one. So I won't go through the results of that regression in detail. There is something I've done. I've tried to make a tool to create this probability around whether someone will volunteer. So you can choose characteristics, and then the probability at the bottom, if you can see, will change. So here I've kind of picked out the person who's most likely to volunteer. So a young white British female who has a degree, is a full-time student, belongs to a religion, has high income, and owns their home, probably quite unlikely. I guess it happens. So there would be about 60, their likelihood of volunteering would be about 60% in London. So yeah, I've created this and I'm not really sure where to go forward and how to use this further. We think of maybe making an online tool. Yeah. In terms of volunteering and well-being, so we can do some regression analysis as well, just looking at the kind of broad association between volunteering and well-being, which generally comes up positive, and there's the problem here, I guess, that people who are happier might volunteer. I think volunteering maybe comes when you've got everything else sorted in life and then you think, oh, go volunteer now. So there's this kind of reverse causality problem. Because we've got the questions in multiple waves for each individual, we can look at change in volunteering status and then change in well-being. So do people who didn't volunteer in wave 2 but then started volunteering have an increase in well-being as well? So we're getting closer to seeing the impacts of volunteering, but we still have this problem that they might have become happier and then thought, oh, I'll volunteer. So it's not completely solved, but I think it's getting a bit closer than a lot of other research studies have. And then the final question was around integration, which is quite London specific. So the questions we're focusing on here is how many friends you have that are similar to you in terms of certain characteristics, so similar age, similar race, similar job, live in the same area. So the answers to these questions are very different from people in London compared to people in the rest of the UK, as you can imagine. And we wanted to look at whether volunteers were more likely to say they have all their friends are similar to them in all these characteristics, or if they had a mix of friends of different ages and different races and different jobs. So we have found some differences in people's friendship groups based on their volunteering status. But yeah, again, I guess there's lots of questions about whether this truly reflects integration, and also a lot of the people who say, you see, the volunteers are less likely to say all their friends are similar to themselves, but they tend to move into the group that say more than half of their friends are similar to themselves. So I don't know, it's not this big chunk of integration, it's a little hop, which is still good. So yeah, I thought I'd open it up to a group discussion and questions. I've got some prompts here. The main question is around dissemination of results. Like I said, I didn't go into too much detail of what the results were, but things we've thought about, we're going to have an event around volunteering in London. This is just focused on myself. This is something London Plus is going to put together at the end of May. And I was going to talk a bit about the research here, but the event's mainly going to be focused around practical solutions. And we're going to have speakers who have dealt with the issue of diversity and volunteering in effective ways and open up the discussion there. But then if anyone wants to comment on the problem around those gaps in the years and whether they think that's a very big problem, that would be really useful. Or anything, any more potential they see in the data that I might have missed out.
So a couple of things. So first of all, I'm interested in how much you've been working with the Team London group here at the GLA, because a lot of this, especially with the volunteering social integration piece, is in common. And in terms of timing with the event you were just talking about, we're just about to release a big revamp of the website for the Team London volunteering thing in mid-May. So let's see if we can coordinate those two things. So there's a question about that. The other thing I was interested in is, as part of this, again with the volunteering stuff, whether you've done any investigation about social prescribing, this idea that you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you know, you should go and volunteer for a thing and that will make you better. Was there any questions about that in the research?
So in terms of timing, this should be finished around the end of May, so that sounds like really good timing.
Mm-hmm.
The funding actually comes from Team London, and it's kind of building on their work around the community life survey. So yeah, having this longitudinal aspect to be able to look deeper into changes in volunteering status. And social prescribing, so there's not much we can do with this data in terms of social prescribing because they just don't ask the right questions. But that's something that we've highlighted as a topic we want to explore once this is finished. So that would be interesting to discuss as well. I think the problem there is the data quality in social prescribing. But yeah, it's definitely something we want to explore next.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, the natural question for me in terms of potential use of the data is the London comparison piece. So I look at all of that and I'm like, oh well, what does this tell me? It doesn't tell me. It tells me a bit about London, but I don't know what to do with that knowledge or that information. So I'd love to know what the figures for everyone else was. Depending on how you've done the analysis, might not be what you want to hear.
No, that has been something I've been thinking about as I've been going along, and definitely where I see good differences between London and the rest of the UK. There's some things I split integration by London and everywhere else, because I think they're very different. I looked at well-being separately, and the results were very similar, so I've just looked at well-being across the UK in general, rather than comparing London separately.
Are there any patterns within London? Presumably, do you have postcode data of those?
I can't go deeper within London, unfortunately, which is frustrating. I think, yeah, partly the sample sizes get very small, and also there's a different level of data security I need to start getting the lower super output area classification. So I haven't been able to link sort of general differences by area.
I think the other potential kind of interesting comparison is with other cities, like world cities as well, because that's sort of the other thing that London could be compared to, what role do volunteers play in other cities throughout Europe and the world.
Yeah, that's a good idea. They can have the cities.
I think it's a great piece of research and it's on the gap in the years, I mean, you're right to flag it, it's huge, so keep that as a footnote. But I really don't think there's that much you can do about it. This is like one of the best surveys we have on this sort of stuff. That's longitudinal, and the reason it's good is the reason why there's gaps, because it does try and include as many topics as possible over the years. So I I think it's worth exploring how like some other people have dealt with that, or at least explained it. But I don't think it kind of cripples the analysis anyway. So really good. One suggestion would be, you've got this probability of being a volunteer. I wonder if there's what might be more useful for like a policymaker is the like probability of moving into volunteering, because that kind of gets you into like the marginal sort of volunteers. Where if I'm in Team London and I want to kind of diversify volunteers, it's useful for me to know who's kind of like the most.
Yeah.
Firstly, the most likely to do it, who isn't, what kind of people they look like, but also the people who there's a real severe gap, because then I might do some more research to sort of see who's very unlikely to move into volunteering. And you can potentially do that with this sort of with this survey and some of the techniques you used. And then if you do that, you can then look at some of the social integration ones where it's like people who move in, are they more likely to see a similar change in, say, the social mixing questions you looked at, but we'd also be interested in things like the wellbeing stuff, things like loneliness and social isolation, and there's a whole range of other things that are very relevant to social integration that can be affected by a move into volunteering.
Yeah.
So that might be something that's helpful.
Yeah, I definitely want to use that move more. And I was a bit worried that you would have people who are quite static in the survey and not many people moving. But when you actually look in it, there are quite a few people who volunteered in one way, but not all of them moved in and out.
Oh, really?
So there is some potential to move and
And then you get around a little bit the issue with the chain. Well, the issue with some people, like you say, some people might like sort their other things out and then move into volunteering. I think it's kind of, you probably correct, but you can control for that as well, right?
Yeah.
You can look at kind of people who've seen similar changes in circumstance.
yeah, and who's more likely
Yeah,
to
and that could be useful.
Moving outward as well, then you could say if it's the like richer students who definitely volunteer, then is there ways you could mean that they keep volunteering when they're in the next age bracket along?
Yeah, stop saying volunteer.
Yeah, and the change, you can correct what we're everyone else to be, but the change, you don't have to use a different sort of regression technique, you're sort of saying a change is
Yeah, you can use the change as like a value
Exactly,
variable to regress it.
Yeah.
But also Natasha got like super smarts on this.
Yeah.
No, I don't know any fixed effects regressions, but I've been trying to use those. But yeah, you can just use a regression to see.
Any more questions, suggestions?
Does anyone have any thoughts around the dissemination of the research? Because I think there's obvious things like a report online. We're trying to think outside the box of it.
Yeah, Natasha and I also do some work trying to get civil society using the data store more, and like data in general, findings like this, and how we can get organisations to actually recognise that as like a tool or a resource they can use. And I don't know, that's like a useful question in general about research, and these reports come out and then it's like, how do you actually use that in your school
I
day to
guess
day?
it might be good to think about like what kind of organisations would use this research,
Mhm.
and then speak to them and ask them like what format would it be helpful? Do you want a report on a website? Like I don't know, maybe like ask them how it could be presented in a way that's most useful to them. Because I'm assuming it's not going to be like something that individuals necessarily will go to. It's more likely to be like civil society organisations and policy makers. So it might be worth like almost like user research.
That's a good idea to ask people. Yeah.
Can I ask, have you published these results in a journal?
No, not yet. So end of May is we'll be finishing the report and publishing around June. But no, not published yet.
On the dissemination point, I don't think I have an opinion just because I don't think we use it. Like, we don't have any resource to actually like recruit volunteers. They're all just word of mouth and see us at conferences and stuff. So that's the only way I could think this would help us recruit volunteers. Otherwise, because we're not doing like policy or advocacy or anything, I don't think we'd be able to make it.
And I guess you've got the volunteer centre network in London, so it's not this nice to test and
ask what they like out of this,
How do you think people, when you went into it, how do you think people would be using the research? What do you think?
I hope it'd be useful in recruitment and just understanding what's going on across useful. But yeah, also to be able to identify groups that would be harder to reach.
Great. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. We've got this room for another 25 minutes to follow up on any conversations or questions you might have from the three people who presented. But yeah, thanks so much for coming. We'll keep you in the loop about other stuff that we're doing, future ones of these, but also other sort of projects and stuff that we're running here. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, and please eat the sandwiches. Yes.
Just one quick thing before everyone starts packing up. If you're interested in this kind of thing, the Institute for Government started running a regular Data Bytes thing as well. Their next one is on Wednesday. You can either go to their site to see if they've got any tickets left, or they'll also be live streaming and recording their event, so you can watch it afterwards. Very similar to this, really interesting, great stuff.
And theirs is Bytes with an I. Great, thank you, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, please stay and chat and eat sandwiches.
okay, for everyone on the stream, that's it. Cheers, folks.